Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground. On this week's episode, we are blessed. We are joined by Tim Mahoney. Tim is the producer and creator of the film series Patterns of Evidence. I know many of you have probably seen the first film in the series called The Exodus, and he's just released a second film called The Moses Controversy, and I was blessed. I got to watch it just the other night, and it was really good. I mean, the first film was fantastic. This was a very important, necessary film to work through. Essentially, he's dealing with the question or the controversy as to whether or not it was possible for Moses to have written the Torah. Because, of course, if Moses didn't write the Torah, then, essentially the whole biblical narrative falls apart. So first of all, let me just jump in and say, Tim, welcome to The Underground.
It's great to be on your show, Joel.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me just jump in. Why is validating the story of the Exodus so important?
Well, it undergirds a lot of the other information in the Bible. In fact, there's so many places that it is referenced. Remember the God who brought you up out of Egypt and into the land that was promised to Abraham. So I think that I could see that throughout the scriptures, the Exodus is referenced, and it's referenced in a way that it believes that it actually happened and that it's foundational. And as we know, there's just an awful lot of different Bible writers who reference it. And some people say, well, that's the Old Testament. It doesn't really matter for the New Testament. But I've got my iPad here, and I was just looking in some different places. We actually see that Jesus, John, Luke, Philip, Peter, Stephen, Paul, James, and the writer of the Hebrews all testify that Moses was the author of the Torah. And so this whole beginning first 5 books of the Bible are really, really foundational to everything else that's built upon it. So that's one of the reasons why, understanding, did it happen? Where did it happen? When did it happen? All those are really important questions to get solved.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, that if the Exodus didn't happen, then Jesus, John, Paul, Peter, Stephen, etc., James, they're all mistaken. They're wrong. And so ultimately, if the Exodus didn't happen, if the Torah, if the narrative recorded in Torah is not valid, then the entire Bible falls apart. It's amazing. It's amazing to sometimes hear Christians and even theologians and scholars actually say, well, this stuff really is important, and validating it is not important because ultimately, we just take it by faith and this sort of thing. And I'm of the opinion that the Lord actually has given us a well-reasoned, intelligent faith that we can. It's not as though we can validate every aspect of biblical history, but I think on most of the important points, He's given us enough evidence that we can look at and say, no, this carries historical weight. It's reasonable. It's not just something we take purely on faith, and it actually makes sense. So I'm grateful for the work that you've been doing. Now, in the film, you talk to a lot of historians, and I know there's probably hours of footage that doesn't make it into the film, but you talk to historians, theologians, archaeologists. You talk to a lot of theologians, scholars, again, who were formerly believers, some of them raised in very traditional Christian homes, many of whom today are agnostics, or probably even some of them may be atheists. What percentage of scholars today would you say actually believe that the Exodus is historical and that it actually took place?
Well, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that it's a smaller number than it's ever been before. And I think that basically people who are people of faith, people that are evangelical scholars, conservative Bible-believing scholars are the ones, and by the way, there's a lot of them. I mean, there are thousands probably of these type of scholars. So as I think about that question, there's probably more people that believe that the Exodus happened than people that don't believe. There's a lot of people who don't know, but but when you move into, let's say, university or schools that are outside of the Christian world, oftentimes those scholars who are sort of part of the academic or academia, as they would call it, circles in Harvard, Yale, Princeton, a lot of them would not believe in the historical credibility of the Exodus as it was written in the Bible. And that's basically what you're going to hear in America, Europe, and even in places in Israel, because they don't see evidence for it. They are thinking that the events of the Exodus didn't happen the way the Bible recorded them, and therefore it's an unreliable story. It's a beautiful story, they would say. In fact, I've heard them say it many times. The narratives of the Bible are beautiful. They're wonderful literature. They're fantastic, but they're not historical. And Joel, the one reason why they say they're not historical is because the time period of the Ramesses time period, about 1250 BC, during that time period, when almost all of the mainstream scholars have basically settled on that is the time of the Exodus, they're saying that they don't see evidence for it, nor for the conquest. And that's what our first film, Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, that's what it looked for. And we found this big pattern of 6 major events. And we said, and the approach of a Patterns of Evidence film is to basically say, okay, well, what does the Bible say? And then what are the patterns that we could find? And that first film looked for the pattern of the arrival of Joseph and his family in Egypt, their multiplication into a large group of people, the enslavement of these people, so something had to change, then the judgment of Egypt, the exodus of these people out of Egypt, and the conquest of the promised land. And I worked on that film for 12 years, and I talked to a lot of people. And it wasn't until I started to basically say, well, let's just look for that pattern. And then we found it earlier in Egyptian history. And some people might say, Joel, are you familiar with the whole question of chronology? Some people might say, well, when did the Exodus happen? The Bible places the Exodus from about 5 different time references to about 1450 BC, based upon when the temple was built. And so that's the time period that the Bible states. But this evidence in Egyptian history was even a little bit earlier than that. And this film then unravels why that is the case. And we think that in that film that builds the case, not myself, but I helped to communicate it, that the Egyptian chronology is off. And so that film then shows that this pattern of evidence is there. It's there, and it matches the Bible. And if you move as some people suggest, correct that history, then you'll see it matches up with the biblical story.
Yeah, and you make a compelling case as well. So essentially, you're working from what is often referred to as the new chronology, championed by David Rohl, who's a scholar, but if I could say it, a bit of a renegade scholar. I mean, he's received a bit of criticism from traditional scholarship, but someone who's really committed himself to this and has a really great grasp, makes a great case for this different chronology, which actually does validate the biblical testimony. Just curiously, and you don't have to answer this if it's not appropriate. David features prominently in your first film. He features prominently in your second film, and he's a real gentleman, interesting guy too. He has a musical background. Some of his stuff going back almost sort of Pink Floyd era. Some of the music that I cut my teeth on in high school and so forth. But he's a guy who is championing the historicity of the Exodus, but yet, if I understand it correctly, he's actually a bit of an agnostic himself. He's not a Christian believer, wouldn't identify as a believer. Do I have that right? I mean, kind of where is he at with faith? Because it's unusual to me that someone who is not convinced in faith is yet sort of devoting his life to validating the Exodus.
Yes, I think that he is an interesting person in that regard. I think the questions that people have, like David Rohl, for example, he has questions about God of the Old Testament versus Jesus of the New Testament. And so he is his conflict, and he needs to speak to it. But as I've interviewed him and talked with him and got to know him, his big challenge has been, the judgment of Egypt and the conquest of the Promised Land and the sort of the brutality of the Bible. So that's one of the challenges that he has, is that he struggles with that, and so there's a lot of steps to becoming let's say, a person of faith, and we just keep talking with him and keep being good friends and trying to help him in his own questions and journey. So, but yes, he believes in the historical story of the Exodus, but he doesn't believe necessarily in miracles. And that's what our next film is going to be working on, the Red Sea miracle.
Your latest film, The Moses Controversy, you're essentially seeking to show that it is indeed feasible that Moses himself did write the Torah. Now, the question I had is, why is this so important to prove or to demonstrate? And you've really already answered that, because the Torah itself claims that Moses wrote the Torah. Jesus believed that Moses wrote the Torah, as do several other authors in the New Testament. But now many scholars say it's impossible, specifically because there was no alphabet available during the time that the Torah would have been written for Moses to have done so. So you essentially posit that a form of alphabetic script, most often called proto-Sinaitic script, is in fact the most ancient form of Hebrew, or at least a type of Hebrew. So what year does this proto-Sinaitic script appear?
The time period that that David Rohl had identified that Joseph and his family lived in Egypt was precisely the time period that this first alphabetic script shows up in Egypt. And so as this film starts the investigation, it's looking for, was there a writing system that Moses could have used? Because you see, they say Hebrew wasn't even around at that time, what they would have called Old Hebrew. It didn't even exist at the time of the Exodus. It only came about at around 900 BC. So our film asks the question, well, what writing system would Moses have used? Was there a writing system available at the time of the Exodus? Or I should say, by the time of the Exodus, in the region of Egypt? It needed to be a form of a Semitic language, because the Israelites were Semitic people. And the fourth one we uncover is that it had to be alphabetic, because all Torah scrolls were in alphabetic language. Now, some people said, well, they could have written in Egyptian, but we were really looking for something that the Israelites could read. And so this proto-Sinaitic script shows up at the time that Joseph and his family in our first film lived in Egypt. And the one thing that's unusual about this is that most scholars today don't believe that the Israelites lived that early or lived at that time. But we had already made a film that basically was identifying that time period. And I had no, let's say, clue earlier that these things were going to align themselves. That all happened. And I was able to, just benefit from that in this investigation. About a year ago, we started to really work on this film. And within the last year, all sorts of other connections started to happen. And that's what I love, Joel, about the patterns of evidence approach, is that you can start seeing multiple areas where there's a sequence of information that then lines up. And we already had that first pattern in the first film. And so this second film just built upon that pattern. And that was really strengthening the argument for the Israelites. And so anyway, I'll let you ask another question, but that was what ended up happening, was we ended up seeing it much earlier. And once again, a lot of people, they don't believe the Israelites lived at that time, so that's why they didn't think there's any connection. But the first film demonstrated that was the case.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how it really all just sort of falls into place. Again, utilizing the earlier chronology and comparing that to sort of the biblical chronology, it really all does sort of fall into place. Now, here's a question that I had in watching the film, because I was actually a little bit unclear on this. Now, on one hand, you're saying that this earliest form of Hebrew would have arisen during the time that Joseph was the ruler in Egypt. But by the same token, you sort of suggest, or did the earliest form of Hebrew appear at the Exodus itself, would have been roughly 400 years later, because you have the story of the tablets, essentially the marriage certificate at Sinai, being initially inscribed by the very finger of God. So I wasn't quite clear if you were saying that the type of Hebrew that you had at the Exodus was identical to i.e. Proto-Sinaitic script that Joseph would have formulated, or was it a bit different? I didn't quite get that in the film.
Yeah, I think that my take on this is that the writing system that shows up, if let's say the film is making the case that Joseph was inspired to to create this, and was that inspiration by God? Because this alphabetic technology that comes along becomes the basis of all alphabets from that point on. So I think that in what the case of the film, I think, is showing or demonstrating is that this alphabet becomes the basis for what Moses would have used. This early alphabetic form of writing could have used then, that eventually becomes what would become Hebrew. And that's what the film is building the case. So if God wrote as the Bible is stating, if one writes the commandments on stone, it's similar to any kind of times when God speaks to people. He probably speaks to them in their own language. If people hear the voice of the Lord and they're Hebrew, they're going to probably hear it in Hebrew. If people hear the voice of the Lord and they're English, they're probably going to hear it in English. But the point of it is that they're listening. And in this particular case, I think the writing was that same way. It would have been given to them in a way that they could understand it.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the degree to which you open yourself up and interview all sorts of different scholars, many of whom are not only critical, but actually somewhat antagonistic toward some of your opinions and so forth. Just curiously, because you're creating these films, I'm sure there are a lot of scholars that will watch it, but by the same token, it's primarily created for lay people to understand this. It's almost like a lot of people, I think we function in such a way that if you were to sit down with a scholar, someone who's dedicated their life, they've got multiple PhDs and decades of dedication to some particular field of study, and they look at you and say, you have no idea what you're talking about here. No one would believe what you're saying. It's really intimidating. It's almost, I don't want to use the word bullying, but sometimes I find that within the academy, there can be a bit of an atmosphere where, there's just such a condescension. It's not condensating, but condescension, just sort of looking down on the average person that doesn't have, a various series of degrees and this sort of thing. But then you go to another scholar, someone else who might have, dedicated their life to another particular field, and they just completely disagree with this other scholar. And there's actually comfort in knowing that all of these folks that have so much confidence in looking down on your particular theory, then you go to another guy, and he may disagree with you on some other aspect of your theory, but then he'll disagree with her or she'll disagree with him. And so I appreciate, again, the approach that you take. Now, let me just ask you this. How has working on these films affected your own personal faith?
Well, I think that, as I shared in the first film, that I had a crisis of faith actually when I first started in 2002, because I wasn't prepared for the negative comments that were coming. And I think that's the case for a lot of people, that they hear these things that are contrary to the stories of the Bible. And if you don't have a safety valve, or if you don't have a way to get answers for those questions, it can cause people to have a crisis of faith. And I was like in my 40s when I went to Egypt, and I had a very strong faith. I didn't have any problems believing in the stories of the Bible. But when I went to the very location where these stories happen, and I was told that there wasn't any evidence for it, I came home here. And I remember sitting in my edit suite, which is in the other room down here. I have my own office building here. And I was looking at this footage, and on a Saturday morning, and I remember thinking, all of a sudden this chill came over me, and this thought came into my mind. Maybe everything that you have believed and that your family has believed is a lie. And at that moment, I mean, I just felt this utter hopelessness, and it was terrifying in a sense. And then another thought came in my mind and said, stop editing, get up and go to your office. So this is my office right here. And I walked into this room and I felt like I was supposed to go to my bookcase right back here and pick up a book. And I did that. I walked up there, pulled out the book, opened it up, and there was, believe it or not, this was a book written by David Rohl. I think it was called Pharaohs and Kings. And I opened that book up and I saw the very dig site that I was sitting, looking at in the other room. I had no idea that this book was here. Someone gave it to me about a year earlier and said, I think you need to read this book. And I go, yeah, I looked at it and I put it on my bookcase. And I've got lots of books that I'm planning, like all of us, to read someday. But I was directed to that book in a very providential way. And I opened it up, and that then began a journey for me to basically head to England. And I did my first interviews. And I had about 3 minutes of information in the very beginning, which ultimately then became what Patterns of Evidence, the Exodus, became. So I just would say to people that there are times when we're faced with big questions, and it might be because something happened in your family. It might be like I had this crisis of faith when you're trying to be legitimate or logical about what you're believing. And it's going to throw you. But I think what you have to do is be patient, be diligent, and start to look for answers. And this new film, The Moses Controversy, that's exactly what this thing uncovers. I mean, there are 3 professors that I interview in the very beginning. All were raised in Christian, Bible-believing homes, conservative homes, and all 3 of them went off to university and basically had their faith in the Bible rocked, and they walked away from their faith. To this day, they're agnostics. Now, I also interview other professors who did not walk away from their faith, but they actually came to a belief, and a stronger belief, because they were able to work out those big questions. And Joel, I think the reason why I'm making these films is to help these big valleys that people are faced with, these big mountains or whatever of doubt or despair or unclarity. I'm kind of going on that journey, investigating the historicity of the Old Testament. And I'm working my way through the Bible. And I'm finding that oftentimes what you only hear is one point of view. But because of the authority that these people have, people, like the average person like myself or anybody, or a young college student, only hears from the authority of that professor. And he's made to believe that there are no other answers. And what ends up happening is it wears down a young college student or anybody. And they then go, well, maybe I'm just believing in a fairy tale. And as you and I know, there are tremendous patterns of evidence out there.
No, absolutely. It's good. Like I said, I appreciate your approach to honest inquiry. I know in my own personal life, for years during the 90s, I was engaged in interfaith dialogue with Muslims. And, a lot of young Muslim men, they approach interfaith dialogue similar to the way they approach jihad. It's a war. It's a war to beat the Christians. And they're hungry for a Christian to argue with. And, a lot of Muslims are incredibly educated, very intelligent. I always tell the story of this one Indonesian fellow that we went back and forth for years. He spoke several languages. This guy, he actually got his master's degree in the history of the development of the Christian canon. He got a master's degree just so that he could argue with Christians that the biblical canon has been corrupted. And, so when you're confronted with this type of assault against your faith, it requires, as you said, patience and just a confidence that if you continue to dig, if you continue to search, if you continue to look for the answers, they're out there. And time again, anytime that I would have sort of that moment of depression where you go, I can't answer this question, I don't know how to answer this question, I would just patiently continue to do my research. And every time you come away from those experiences going, oh my goodness, the answers are out there. The answers are there. Our faith is a historical, well-reasoned faith. But unfortunately, as you said, a lot of kids in college, they just, they don't have access. I mean, it's sort of just a merging of multiple factors. As you said, the authority of these professors, the confidence with which they make these assertions at this sort of, sometimes sensitive period of their life after they've just left home for the first time. And it takes a lot of people out. But it's important for people to realize that if they, as you said, continue to seek and you will find. And I've experienced that many times in my life, where just multiple times I won't say a crisis of faith, but where I've gone through, a depressed season because I didn't initially have the answers. And then I would order the big stack of books and then work through them and then come away just so strengthened in my faith time and time again. So a different subject, but sort of the same type of battle experience. So let me ask you this question. As you know, I write a lot about eschatology in the end times, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but if you just sort of look out and survey the current atmosphere in the world right now, the atmosphere in the Western church, just in pondering the possibility of the return of Jesus or the season that we're in or any of these things, why do you think it's right now? Why do you think the Lord at this moment in history is drawing so much attention back to the Exodus? Why do you think if I can say it this way, why do you think he's raised you up to be a voice to, again, to validate the historicity and the validity of all of this? Why do you think at this moment, what do you think the Lord is up to?
Boy, that's a very tough question to answer. I think that in my own case, as I was raised in a Christian home. I was raised in a church that believed in the return of Christ, and in fact, I heard about it from the time I was a young child, and we were always worried about being left behind, as it were, if you did something wrong, and I think that a lot of people have forgotten about this. And I have always been fascinated by history and by the fact that, as they say, history repeats itself. So what I didn't know is that the story of the Exodus is actually the plagues of the Exodus, by the way, are repeated in the book of Revelation. And I always say, is it Revelations or Revelation? Is there an S on the end of there? Revelation, yeah. And so that's very interesting. And so the story of the Exodus is something I would say that I think I'm making films of remembrance and of forewarning, if I were to say the kinds of films that I think I'm making. And you say, well, what does that mean? And I said, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that we have to remember the past, because if you look at it, the story of the Israelites, they were trapped at the sea. The plagues, the story of going through the sea, passing through, there's these theological understandings of what happened that people today look back on and they go, oh, they see a parallel between that and what happened in the New Testament. But it's possible, too, that many of the things that are in the Bible are for multiple times throughout history. They can be looked at and taken in a new way. And if we look at Israel today, and we look at the story of the Israelites, they're in a similar situation right now where they are trapped at a sea, and there are forces that would come against them to try to drive them into the sea. And so I think that these films are important both for the Jewish people and for the entire world to understand, because there is a remembrance of who are these, what's this about, what's happening, is there a bigger thing happening here? And I think that oftentimes a lot of us are not thinking. I don't know if you know this, Joe, but the word muse means to think, and the word means not. And so amusement means not to think, to spend time not thinking. But I think that more and more people have to be able to be clear in their thinking, have a much better ability to understand what's really going on, what's happening in this world, and know how they should think in order for them to know how to prepare, for them how to react to certain things, and how they might live their life currently. So I think there's a sense of, there are things that I filmed that are in waiting, And I'm hoping and just believing that I'll be able to get to them. There's a lot of things that I know about that I can't share yet because they're for future films. And we're just trying to continue to be diligent in what we're doing and tell these stories. And my goal and our hope here, and I'm Thinking Man Films, is there's a group of us here, and we've got people that have invested and have supported us, is to go through the Bible and to continue to unfold. Does God act in history? And what evidence do we have? And what does that mean? So you saw the wall of time. There are times when we know that God has inspired the prophets to write certain things. And I'm curious and very interested in those writings. And did they happen? Because that's demonstrating, if you can find evidence of something being written at one time and it occurring in the future. And sometimes we know that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, certain things that were written about were trapped in a cave, in a jar. And we look at the future, and if you interpret it properly, which some people don't want to do, you can see them happening, those events happening, such as, for example, the destruction of Jerusalem and the diaspora of the Israelites, being spread throughout the land. That was the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai. Basically said that if you disobey, Moses said, if you break this covenant, I'm going to destroy you as a nation. I'm going to scatter you around the world. You're going to be persecuted, but in the future, you will return. And that has happened twice. I mean, in a sense, it happened with the Babylonians and then later on with the Romans. And, what do we know is we know that, how likely was that to have happened with the return to the land? So I think for people that are interested in the Bible, archaeology, history, and what's happening in the future, I think that's, I am too. I'm interested in that, and I want to know how I should react to it.
Amen. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic answer. I love how you said, what I do is I make films of remembrance and films of warning. And that was essentially what I was getting to with the question, is that, as we've talked about the Exodus repeatedly, the overarching statement that the Lord continues to state throughout the Passover and throughout the Exodus is remember, 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 remember. And it's just, we live in this age where it seems like everyone is forgotten. I mean, the whole world is forgotten. Half of the academic community rejects it. Much of the church today isn't even really clear. I was coming back from Saudi Arabia last year, and I believe that I had just been at the location of what I believe to be the real Mount Sinai there at Jabal al-Lawz, and I'm on the plane in Amsterdam, and I'm sitting next to this guy, and he has this real clear New York City Jewish accent. I'm originally from Boston, and I can pick out this guy's accent immediately. And he says, "Oh, where are you coming from?" And I said, "Well, I was just in Saudi Arabia." And he said, What in the world were you doing there?" And I said, "Well, believe it or not, I think I was just hiking around the real Mount Sinai the past few days." And he immediately just said, "Oh, come on, that's not true. None of that stuff is true." And I said, "What do you mean it's not true? Are you observant?" And he says, "Oh yeah, I'm conservative. I go to synagogue, but I don't believe, no one believes the Exodus actually happened anymore." And I just looked at him and I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "Look, I'm the Gentile here. You're supposed to be convincing me of this, and I'm not supposed to be the one convincing you of the reality of your own stories." And, so much of the world has forgotten. So much of the Jewish world has forgotten. So much of the church has forgotten. And I believe that it's at this moment in history, with the timing and the sovereignty of God, that he is, through your work, and I think even through my work and the work of several others, he's calling our attention back to Sinai, back to the Exodus, back to the things that he did. Remember the things that I did with a mighty and outstretched hand. Because, why is he reminding everyone? Because it's, again, as you touched on it, in the book of Acts, you look at the sermons of Peter and Paul and Stephen, and they always harken back to the Exodus before they proclaim the return of Jesus. They say, these things happened, and because these things happened, we can be confident that these other things are going to take place. And I really believe he's giving the world an opportunity, essentially, to wake up and realize we live in an age of unbelief, but it's the unbelief that's an illusion. and that he has appointed a man, and a man is coming back to judge the living and the dead, the man Christ Jesus. So with that said, I want to tell everybody, if you have not seen either of the films, then make sure you go out and do so right away. They're long, they're a couple hours each, but they're worth investing the time in. They're so well done. If someone wants to watch the film, what's the easiest and best way they can do that, Tim?
Well, they can see it both digitally, and they could get a DVD. I always like the DVD because I think that then you can pass around, and I'm always suspect of what's going to happen to our digital stuff in the future, whether or not you could find it or have it, or whether it be accessible. So we have a website, Patterns of Evidence, patternsofevidence.com, and that is where you can see a lot of the films that we have in the books. And we actually have what's called Thinker Updates, weekly Thinker Updates that we try to post on Bible and archaeology.
Okay, excellent. So patternsofevidence.com, and you can buy the DVDs there. And is that where you go to also watch it if you just want to do it streaming?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, we have streaming links. The new film, The Moses Controversy, Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy, will be out in just a few weeks. But the first film on the Exodus is available. And we also have a children's series called Young Explorers, which is also available.
Fantastic. Okay, so one last question before I let you go. What's next? What is the next film going to address?
We're working on Patterns of Evidence, The Red Sea Miracle. And in fact, I just came up from the edit suite. We're working on that film. It's going to cover the which way did the Israelites go? What sea did they cross? And we're looking at the different crossing sites. And then the big question of miracles. Can miracles happen? Does God part water? If so, how deep? People are saying, or are miracles just coincidences of nature? And so we're going to look at that. And then the film after that, which I think you'd be very interested in, and I'd probably like to get you in on it, which is Journey to Mount Sinai, where we're going to look at the different locations for Mount Sinai, from the traditional Mount Sinai, mountains like Har Karkum I went to this year, Jebel Lawz. I've actually been to Jebel Lawz as well in 2003, and you've been there. So we're going to look at the different mountains and compare the patterns of evidence for the journey to Mount Sinai.
Yeah, by the way, when you were there with Deb Hearn, she's Australian PhD student there at Har Karkum, I was up there in Jerusalem a day or so just before you, and then had dinner with Deb and her professor, and just missed you. Almost caught you there when you were in Israel, but we just missed each other by a few hours, I think. But yeah, looking forward to that. So listen, again, friends, I just want to encourage you. This is important. The historicity, the validity, and understanding the arguments around these things is important. And it's not just important historically. The Lord does have a testimony. And as we began to touch on, there's a lot of revelation there with regard to what's coming. The same God that came down in a cloud, in blazing fire, with the blasting of trumpets, with the mountain shaking, a mighty earthquake, he's coming back in the clouds, in blazing fire, in the glory of his Father, with the blasting of the trumpets and a mighty earthquake, and he's coming back to judge the living and the dead, and the Lord has a testimony. So amen and amen. Tim, thanks so much. Really looking forward to what comes next. And yeah, if there's anything I can do, I would love to speak into that, because this has really just kind of surprised me. It's just become out of the blue a passion that the Lord has sort of thrown me into. And I've just been parked on this thing, not for 14 years, but just for the past year. And I've just absolutely fallen in love with the Exodus and the story. So thank you so much for all that you're doing. It really, truly is. It's a prophetic work, and it's an invaluable work. It's a genuinely prophetic work. So we really appreciate it.
Well, if people go to our website, they can see trailers for both of these films. And that scene that you just talked about the mountain, is in our second film, The Moses Controversy, where we show a connection between the writing of the Bible, the alphabet, and the early Israelites, which spread then throughout the world, this alphabet. So thanks again. We'll talk with you later, Joel.
All right. Thank you so much, Tim. Our friends, well, that is all the time that we have for this week. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.